Well, joining us, she wrote this month's cover story for U.S. news magazine The Atlantic. Julia Ioffe is in The Atlantic's newsroom in Washington, D.C. Thank you for speaking with us on France 24.
Thanks so much for having me.
Your reaction to Ksenia Sobchak asking that question of Vladimir Putin?
You know, it's a brave question, but it's also part of the tradition of this news conference that Ksenia Sobchak, because she is the daughter of Putin's political mentor, the man who gave him his start in politics, she has traditionally asked the most provocative question at these news conferences because she's kind of immune. She's safer than all the other journalists. And the fact that she was asking it this year while she's running for president is a little weird because she's asking about competition, which does not exist in Putin's Russia. Political competition simply is not there because Putin has completely wiped the field clean. And it's also interesting because Ksenia Sobchak is not seen by the opposition, the liberal opposition, as a real candidate. She's seen as a kind of AstroTurf candidate that's supposed to give the liberal opposition somebody to vote for, a kind of steam valve. So it's interesting she's asking about competition when people, her own supposed constituency, doesn't take her seriously as competition to Putin.
You mentioned in your piece how Vladimir Putin, it's not a dictatorship in the strongest sense of the world, but the Kremlin likes to see it as a managed democracy.
That's right, but that's how they'd like to see it. It's not a democracy by any means. There are trappings of democracy, there are trappings of a free press, but they are window dressing, and they're allowed to exist at a bare minimum in a very controlled way. The press, the independent press, has mostly been killed off. I say that metaphorically. Most journalists have not been killed off. It's just most independent news outlets have been driven out of business simply, and journalists don't have anywhere to work. And the few places that remain are very marginalized and exist solely for Putin to brush off Western criticism. That's very important to him, what the West thinks of him. So we can't accuse him of being a North Korean-style dictator or even a Stalin-esque dictator because he says, look, we have elections. I even run against guys. Of course, all those guys are of course, on his payroll. Or he says, I have free media. They criticize me all they want. Of course, they are relegated to the margins and have very minimal audiences. So, it's kind of, it exists to deflect Western criticism and nothing more.
When we see the cover picture of him, he looks a little bit ominous there. But actually, in your piece, you portray a Russia that's not strong, but weak. And those aren't your words. Those are the words of higher up inside of his United Russia party. He says, look, nothing works here. I'm paraphrasing a bit. And he says, and he even says, well, our hackers are suddenly amazing. He even questions how good the Russian hackers are.
Right. I think it's a little bit disingenuous, right? He's close to the Kremlin. I think the hackers are quite good, but they also had a lot of luck. Nobody in Russia expected Donald Trump to be elected. Nobody expected the Russian efforts to bear that much fruit. And it's still unclear to what extent they worked. That said, speaking about Russia more generally, it is a very weak country, and the strength comes from projecting aggression, from projecting a strength that isn't always really there. It is kind of a giant on rusted legs, which is what people said about the Soviet Union. It's not the strong power that we believe it to be in the U.S. It's funny, when I lived in Russia, the conspiracy theorists close to the government would say, oh, this is all the State Department's doing. And in their eyes, the State Department was capable of everything and anything and had this massive budget and tons of people everywhere who were super brilliant and capable of anything, which is hilarious if you ever actually set foot inside the State Department and see how skimpy their budget is and how they're always strapped for cash and they're bureaucratic and risk averse. But, in the Russians' eyes, they were this great, magnificent power. In the same way, in the U.S., we look at Russia and we see them as much stronger than they are and as much more capable than they are, than most Russians believe their own country to be. So in some ways, it's a huge compliment this kind of vilifying of Russia. It's a huge compliment from the Americans to the Russians.
And on the subject of the hacking, let's take another listen to Vladimir Putin. There were the inevitable questions about the hacking of the U.S. elections and the usual denials, Putin calling the charges invented. Let's listen.
You know, all of these collusion stories were made up by people who are opposed to President Trump and who are trying to shed a negative light onto what he's doing. And for me, it's very bizarre. It's as if they were doing that without understanding a simple fact, that they're dealing a blow to the United States' internal political environment. It's impeding what President Trump is doing, and it shows a lack of respect for those who voted for him.
On that score, Julia Ioffe, the Newswire is pointing out that Putin's rhetoric during this press conference eerily parallels that of Trump.
Exactly. It's exactly what I was going to say. That said, it's not particularly inventive, right? So I kind of agree with him that that alleging, as many Democrats do, that the Russians through the election that it was the Russians who elected Donald Trump is not true, and it isn't fair, and it's not. It's a very Putin-esque thing to blame it on somebody else, on an outsider, as opposed to having to contend with a real organic political reality, which is that 60-some million American citizens voted for Donald Trump, who is a purely American phenomenon. So that said, the Russians, if you look at if you look at the Russian rhetoric and the Trump camp's rhetoric, they often parallel each other, but it's not that always that the Russians are planting ideas with Trump or Trump is planting ideas with the Russians. The Russians don't exist in a vacuum. They watch the news. They read they read the stuff coming out of the U.S.
The two sides are feeding off one another. Julia Ioffe, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to say once again, bravo for that cover story in The Atlantic, which you can read this month.